It was the kind of hospital most people avoided, tucked away at the edge of town where the lights flickered in and out, and the air felt heavy with the weight of its age. For years, it had served its purpose as a small, almost forgotten facility that dealt with emergencies, minor surgeries, and long-term care for those who needed it most. Most patients were elderly or too sick to move, and there was a sense of abandonment in the sterile, dimly lit halls. It was the perfect place for a night shift nurse to settle into a routine of monotony. On one particular night, though, the silence of the hospital seemed different. It was thicker, almost suffocating, as if something was lurking just outside the nurse's station, waiting to be acknowledged. This nurse had worked at the facility for years, so she knew the usual sounds, the soft beeping of the machines, the distant murmurs from the patients' rooms, and the occasional shuffle of feet in the hallway. But tonight something was off. It was just past 3 a.m., the time when the night shift is often at its quietest. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights above her. She was sorting through some paperwork at the nurse's station when she first heard it, a slow, dragging sound coming from the hallway outside the ICU. At first, she thought it was just one of the older patients, someone who had gotten up to use the bathroom or needed assistance. But the sound didn't stop. It wasn't the usual shuffle of slippers or the soft scrape of a walker against the floor. This sound was heavy. Each step seemed to drag across the floor with a deliberate, unnerving slowness, as though someone was struggling to move, or perhaps something was moving. The nurse stood up from her desk, her curiosity piqued but tempered with a sense of unease. She walked toward the door, peering out into the hallway, expecting to see a patient in need of help. The hallway was empty. The lights flickered slightly above, casting long shadows across the walls. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to step further into the corridor. She had been working this shift for years, and though she had seen and heard strange things before, echoes in the halls, fleeting figures at the corner of her eye, this was different. The air seemed colder now, and the dragging sound was still there, though it was fainter, almost as if it were retreating further down the hall. She pushed the door open slightly, peeking around the corner, but again, no one was there. The hallway stretched on in front of her, eerily quiet. The dragging stopped, but she could still hear the faintest shuffling sound, as if something was shifting just out of view. She tried to calm herself. Perhaps it was just a malfunctioning part of the old building. The pipes, the vents, maybe even the shift in the air from the cooling system. But as she stood there, the unease gnawed at her. Something felt wrong. As she stepped further into the hallway, the lights above flickered again, and this time the shadow at the end of the corridor caught her eye. There, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with a posture that seemed wrong. The way it stood, leaning slightly to one side, made the nurse's skin crawl. The figure wasn't moving, but there was something about its presence that made her heart race. It didn't belong there. She took a step back, her breath shallow, as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. Was it a patient who had gotten out of bed? But the figure was too tall, and it didn't resemble anyone she knew from the ICU. She blinked, and in that moment, the figure seemed to grow even darker, the shadows around it stretching like tendrils. The air turned colder. Her body froze, her feet unable to move, as though the darkness was holding her in place. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. One moment it was there, standing at the far end of the hallway, and the next it had vanished into the walls. No footsteps, no sound. Just silence. The nurse stood there for what felt like an eternity, her pulse racing, unable to move from where she stood. She never spoke of the incident to anyone. She couldn't. She wasn't sure if anyone would believe her. But after that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. A few weeks later, she left the hospital. She never returned. Something in that building had changed that night, something she couldn't explain, something that had lingered long after the figure had disappeared. The factory was a sprawling complex, abandoned for years and left to decay in the shadows of the city. It had once been a place of industry and movement, but now, the only thing that remained was its rusting machinery and dark, empty hallways. Most people avoided it, and for good reason. The stories of strange occurrences and eerie happenings in the building were enough to keep anyone away. But for the night shift security guard, it was just another job. He had worked here for months, and had grown accustomed to the isolation and quiet that came with being the only one in the factory at night. The night started like any other. He walked the perimeter of the building, checking doors and windows, ensuring that everything was secure. The silence inside the factory was absolute. The kind of silence that seemed to press in on you, making even the smallest sound feel deafening. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of rust lingered in the corners of the rooms. It was the kind of place where you didn't want to linger too long. The walls seemed to close in on you, the darkness swallowing up everything in its path. Around midnight, the guard was sitting at the security desk in the small office, sipping on a cup of lukewarm coffee. The dull hum of the surveillance monitors and the occasional creak of the building were the only sounds breaking the silence. He was used to the stillness, the emptiness that seemed to define the factory at night. But tonight, something felt different. There was an unease in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. At first, it was just a sense of being watched, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. But as the hours passed, the feeling grew stronger. He decided to take another walk around the building to shake off the unease, to check the security cameras and make sure everything was in order. As he walked through the main hall, the temperature seemed to drop. It wasn't just a slight chill. No, it was something far colder, a sharp, biting cold that seemed to come out of nowhere. He stopped, pulling his jacket tighter around him, wondering if there was a draft somewhere. But the cold was too intense, too sudden. He shivered, looking around the empty factory floor, but nothing seemed out of place. He continued walking, his footsteps echoing through the massive hall, but as he reached the back of the building, he heard it, a faint sound, like a whisper. He paused, thinking it was just the wind, the creaking of the factory settling into its usual rhythm. But then the whisper came again, clearer this time, as though it was just behind him. It was soft at first, a murmur that he couldn't make out, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice low and guttural, speaking words that sent a chill racing up his spine. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no one there. The factory was empty, the air still, and yet the whispers continued, drifting through the cold, empty space. He felt his stomach tighten, a knot of fear growing inside him. He listened closely, trying to make sense of the words, but they were too faint, too distorted. The whispers seemed to come from every direction at once, as though the walls themselves were speaking. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the voice was trying to communicate something to him. It felt like it was right beside him, just out of reach, but when he turned to look, there was nothing. No one. He could hear the sound of his own breath, shallow and quick, as his mind raced. The voice seemed to be calling his name, and with each passing moment, the unease in his chest deepened. It wasn't just the voice that unsettled him. It was the feeling that the factory itself was alive, watching him, aware of his every movement. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that made the air feel thick and heavy. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something move. It was quick, just a shadow in the periphery of his vision, but it was enough to make his heart race. He turned sharply, shining his flashlight into the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing there. The factory was as empty as it had been before. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to head back to the security office. But as he turned to leave, he heard it again. The faint, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It was coming from the far end of the hallway, and it sounded too deliberate to be an accident. The guard's instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of the building, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He was torn between the desire to flee and the need to investigate, to make sure nothing was wrong. He took slow, careful steps toward the source of the sound, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The dragging grew louder with each step he took, as though it was getting closer. His pulse quickened and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. When he reached the source of the noise, he stopped dead in his tracks. There at the end of the hallway was nothing. The space was empty. The sound had stopped and the building seemed eerily still. He looked around, but there was no sign of movement, no indication of where the noise had come from. He stood there, for a long moment, his mind racing. The temperature had dropped even further, and the air felt thick with something unexplainable. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an unsettling quiet. He didn't know how much longer he could stay in the factory. Every instinct told him to leave, to run as far away as possible. But he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that building wasn't done with him yet. And as he turned to leave, the dragging sound started again, this time behind him. The call center was located in a nondescript building at the edge of town. It wasn't a large facility, but it was always buzzing with activity during the day. However, when the night shift began, it felt like the place transformed into something else entirely. The usual energy dissipated, leaving behind a dull, oppressive silence. The worker, a young woman who had taken on the night shift to make ends meet, had become accustomed to the long hours and the quiet solitude. Most of the time, the only sounds were the soft clicks of keyboards and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. But tonight, something was different. It was just past midnight when the first strange call came through. She had been sitting at her desk, mindlessly answering the usual inquiries and assisting with issues when the phone rang. It was an unremarkable start to what she expected would be another long night. But when she picked up, the voice on the other end made her pause. The tone was raspy and strained, as if the person had been talking for far too long or perhaps hadn't spoken in days. It sounded faint, distant and yet undeniably close, as though it was coming from just beside her ear, but at the same time from miles away. "Hello?" she said, trying to steady her nerves. The voice on the other end replied in a whisper that was barely audible. "Can you hear me?" She frowned, thinking it was a prank. It wouldn't be the first time a caller tried to mess with a night shift worker. But there was something unsettling in the way the voice echoed in her ears. It wasn't just the words, but the delivery. The voice was filled with desperation, with a faint sense of urgency. "I can hear you," she replied slowly, glancing around the empty office. A long pause followed, the kind of pause that stretched just a little too long, making her uneasy. When the voice finally spoke again, the words that came through were clearer but still strange, almost as if they were being dragged from the depths of some forgotten memory. "I see you," the voice said. Her heart skipped a beat. She pulled the phone away from her ear, checking the caller ID, but it was blocked. The number didn't exist. She hesitated, trying to laugh it off. Maybe it was a glitch, maybe just a prankster. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something about it felt wrong. Something about that voice felt off. "Who is this?" she asked, trying to remain calm. There was a moment of silence before the voice came back, this time even quieter. "I can see you right now." Her hands began to tremble as she held the phone tighter, trying to steady herself. There was no one else in the office. The lights flickered overhead, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights growing louder for a split second before returning to its usual hum. She glanced around again, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. But the office was empty. She tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to fatigue. It had been a long shift after all. But the voice on the other end wouldn't let her forget. It kept speaking, whispering words she couldn't quite understand, but each time, the words seemed to grow more personal, more intimate. "You don't remember me, do you?" the voice asked. A soft, rasping sound. She felt a cold chill run down her spine. The voice sounded almost familiar, but she couldn't place it. She glanced at her computer screen, trying to distract herself. But the cursor on the screen flickered and jumped as if someone was typing, even though her fingers hadn't moved. The tension in the air was thick, as if something invisible was hanging around her, watching her every move. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and tried to focus on the call. "I don't know who you are," she replied, her voice wavering. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Then, almost too quietly to hear, the voice whispered again, "I know who you are." She froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. That was too much. How could they know who she was? She had never given any personal information on these calls, never shared anything beyond the basics. She wasn't even sure if this was a customer at all. "I don't know what you want," she said, trying to regain control of the situation, but her voice felt small, like it was being swallowed by the silence of the office. "I'll be there, soon," the voice murmured, its tone almost playful now, like a cruel joke that she was too frightened to understand. Without thinking, she slammed the phone down, the receiver clattering against the desk. She sat there for a moment, her mind racing. Was this a prank? Was someone messing with her? It didn't feel like a prank, though. It felt like something much worse, something darker. She stared at the phone, the silence in the room almost suffocating now. The phone rang again. Her hand shook as she picked it up, her mind screaming for her to just leave, to get out of the building and never return. But she couldn't leave. She was stuck in the office, alone in the building. The number was blocked again, and she hesitated before answering, her breath shallow. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This time the voice didn't respond immediately. Instead, she heard a strange noise, like a faint rustling, like someone moving just outside her door. She glanced toward the office entrance, but there was no one there. The door was still locked and no one had entered the building, but the noise grew louder. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was out there. The voice came back softer this time, as if it was right next to her ear. "I'm here." Her breath caught in her throat. She quickly hung up the phone, her pulse racing. She stood, up from her desk, her legs trembling. The noise outside the office had stopped, but now she was certain that she wasn't alone. Something was in the building with her. She looked around, her mind frantic. There was nowhere to go. The building was old and the security system was inadequate at best. She didn't know what to do, who to call. But one thing was clear: the voice had been right. It knew where she was, and she had no idea how it had found her. The lights flickered again and the phone rang once more. It was a small convenience store tucked away at the end of a quiet street, the kind of place that served as a late-night refuge for anyone who needed a snack or a drink after the usual stores had closed. For the night shift worker, it was a job that was both predictable and uneventful. He had worked there for months, the hours slipping by with little more than the sound of the soft hum of the coolers and the occasional car passing by outside. He knew the rhythms of the store, when the regulars would come in, when the odd late-night customer would walk through the door, and when the town would settle into its usual sleep. But tonight was different. It was a quiet evening, the kind where time seemed to slow down, stretching into an eternity of nothingness. The store was empty, save for the worker behind the counter, his eyes barely open as he tried to stay awake. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the aisles of neatly stacked goods. He absent-mindedly flipped through a magazine, his mind half on the stories in front of him, half on the ticking clock. It was one of those nights where he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, a figure walked into the store. The man was tall, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket, and his movements were slow, deliberate. There was something strange about him, something that made the worker's stomach tighten with unease. He looked up from his magazine, meeting the man's gaze for a moment. The stranger didn't speak, just walked to the back of the store and began browsing the shelves. The worker watched him for a few moments, unsure of what to make of him. The store had always been a place where odd characters passed through, but there was something about this man that felt different. He moved with a strange sense of purpose, his eyes scanning the aisles without really looking at anything. He seemed detached, as though he was in his own world. The worker shook off the feeling and returned to his magazine, trying to push the unease out of his mind. He told himself it was just the fatigue talking, that he was probably just overthinking things. But every time he glanced up from the page, he couldn't help but notice the man. He had made his way to the refrigerated section, and now he was just standing there staring at the rows of drinks. The stillness of the scene made it feel even stranger. The worker's eyes narrowed. There was something off about the way the man stood, his body completely motionless. He hadn't picked anything up, hadn't moved in what felt like several minutes. It was as if he was waiting for something, or perhaps he was simply lost in thought. The worker tried to ignore him, but the tension in the air had grown thicker. It was a sensation that prickled the back of his neck, the feeling that he wasn't alone in the store, that something was quietly watching him from the shadows. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, his mind racing with strange thoughts, and then, almost as if on cue, the man moved. He turned slowly, almost as though his movements were deliberate, and made his way toward the counter. The worker watched him approach, feeling an inexplicable dread settle in his chest. The man's face was still hidden in the shadows of his hood, but now that he was closer, the worker could see something that made his blood run cold. The man's eyes. They were hollow, not just tired or distant, but completely empty. There was no reflection in them, no spark of life, just a dark void staring back at him. The man leaned against the counter, his hands resting on the edge. The worker swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice shaky, the words barely escaping his lips. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply stared at him, his head tilting slightly, as if studying him. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, the tension in the air growing unbearable. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and distant. "I've been here before." The worker blinked, confused. "What?" The man's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been here before," he repeated. "A long time ago." The worker felt his pulse quicken. He had worked at the store for years, and he knew that this was the first time he had ever seen this man. The town was small, everyone knew everyone, or at least recognized familiar faces. But this man, he didn't belong. "I don't think I've seen you here before," the worker said, trying to steady his voice, but his words came out sounding hollow and unsure. The man didn't reply. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled, yellowed receipt. He set it on the counter, his fingers brushing against the surface in a way that felt unnatural, like they were not meant to be touching anything at all. The worker glanced at the receipt and his stomach dropped. It was old, the paper worn and faded, but there was no mistaking the date. It was from years ago, long before the worker had even started working at the store. The name at the top, barely visible from the age of the paper, was one that he didn't recognize. A chill ran down his spine as he looked up at the man, but the stranger had already turned and was heading for the door. The worker watched him leave, the sound of the door opening and closing almost deafening in the stillness of the store. He stood there for a long time, staring at the receipt, his mind spinning. What had just happened? The store was quiet once, more. But the feeling of unease lingered in the air, heavy and thick. The worker glanced at the door, half expecting the man to return, but the street outside was empty, the night as silent as ever. It wasn't until the morning, when the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the windows, that he finally felt like he could breathe again. But even then, the memory of the man, of his empty eyes and strange words, stayed with him. It was only later, when he looked at the receipt again, that he realized something truly terrifying. The name on it was his own. The hospital's emergency room had always been a place of chaos, even during the quietest shifts. But tonight everything felt different. The usual hum of activity seemed to have dulled into something more foreboding, like the calm before a storm. For the night nurse, it was just another shift. Another night of monitoring patients, answering calls, and dealing with whatever came through the door. She had worked in this ER for years, so she was used to the unpredictable nature of the job. But tonight there was an underlying tension in the air, a feeling she couldn't shake, no matter how many times she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. The first sign that something was off came when the lights began to flicker. It was subtle at first, just a faint flicker that barely registered. But as the night wore on, The interruptions became more frequent, more erratic. The nurse would be walking down the hallway, making her rounds when the lights would cut out completely for a split second, only to return a moment later, casting the hallway in an eerie, disjointed glow. She shrugged it off at first, thinking it was just a minor electrical issue that would be fixed soon. But as the minutes stretched on, the flickering became more persistent, and the uneasy feeling in her gut grew stronger. Her first real moment of unease came when she entered room 203 to check on a patient who had been admitted earlier in the evening. He was an older man, disoriented and frail, but otherwise stable. His family had been notified, and he was scheduled to be transferred to a room on a different floor in the morning. The nurse entered the room expecting to find him sleeping, but instead, he was sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide open and unblinking. At first, she thought he might be awake, staring at the television or lost in thought. But as she took a few steps closer, she realized something was wrong. His breathing was shallow, ragged, and his eyes were fixed on something beyond her, something she couldn't see. The nurse paused, a chill running down her spine, but she quickly brushed it aside. She'd seen many patients in similar states. Some were disoriented, others delirious. "Mr. Evans?" she called softly, reaching for his wrist to check his pulse. But as her hand touched his skin, she recoiled. It wasn't cold, but it was unnaturally still, too still. The pulse she had expected to feel was absent, as though his body had become motionless in time with his eyes. She took a step back, alarm, bells ringing in her mind, but before she could react, the old man's eyes shifted toward her. "Help me," he whispered, his voice raspy and broken. The nurse froze. She was certain she had seen his eyes move, but there was no denying what had just happened. She reached for her radio to call for assistance, but before she could speak, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into near darkness. When they returned, the man was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets neatly arranged as though no one had ever been there. Her breath caught in her throat as she rushed to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She stepped into the hallway, her eyes darting around, but there was no sign of the elderly man. Confused, she quickly moved to the nurse's station and checked the records. Room 203 was still marked as occupied, with Mr. Evans listed as a patient. But when she spoke to her colleagues, none of them had seen him leave. It didn't make sense. She had just been in that room moments before, and yet the man had vanished. She was beginning to doubt her own senses when the second event occurred. The hospital was relatively quiet that night, with only a few patients being admitted and a steady stream of minor cases. But when the nurse entered the trauma bay to assess a new patient, a young woman who had been in a car accident, she was confronted with something that froze her blood. The woman was unconscious, hooked up to a ventilator and surrounded by a team of doctors. But it wasn't the condition of the patient that terrified her. It was the faint, soft sound of laughter echoing from somewhere in the room. The laughter wasn't loud or maniacal. It was soft, almost like the quiet chuckle of someone hiding in the shadows. It was a sound that shouldn't have been there, and it seemed to come from every corner of the room, following her every movement. The nurse looked around, trying to pinpoint the source, but there was nothing. The doctors were focused on the patient, and the monitors continued to beep steadily, but the laughter remained like a whisper in the air. She could feel it crawling under her skin, making her skin prickle with fear. She had to leave. She knew she had to get out of that room before whatever was lurking in the hospital found her too. But as she turned to walk out, the lights flickered again, and the laughter stopped. A new sound filled the room. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the hallway outside. She quickly exited, her heart racing. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered, like a dark presence looming just beyond the corner. As the night wore on, the strange occurrences continued. The lights flickered with increasing frequency, and the temperature in the hospital seemed to drop inexplicably, leaving her feeling chilled to the bone. There was an unmistakable feeling of being followed, as though someone, or something, was always just out of sight. Every time she turned a corner, she half expected to see something or someone waiting for her. The final straw came just before dawn. The nurse entered the storage room to fetch some supplies when she felt a sudden rush of air. The room was cold, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. She spun around, but the door was still closed. Then she heard it, the faintest whisper, soft and distant, calling her name. She couldn't move. It felt like the room itself was closing in on her, the walls pressing together, the shadows stretching longer. She turned quickly, but as she reached for the door, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure standing in the corner of the room, its face obscured by shadow, but its presence unmistakable. The whispering grew louder, and she bolted from the room, never once looking back. She ran straight to the nurse's station, breathless, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she looked behind her, the hallway was empty. Empty. And yet she could still feel the eyes watching her from the shadows. The small cafe on the outskirts of town had been around for as long as anyone could remember. It wasn't the type of place that drew crowds, but it had its regulars, a handful of loyal customers who would come in for their morning coffee or a late-night snack after a long day. The night shift worker, a young man in his mid-20s, had grown accustomed to the late-night solitude. The quiet was something he had come to cherish, especially after spending his days dealing with the hustle and bustle of a busy office job. The cafe was small, just a few tables and a counter with an espresso machine and some pastries in the display case. The lights were always dim in the evenings, casting long shadows across the floor. The atmosphere was cozy, even if it did feel a little too quiet, sometimes. It was nearing the end of his shift when the first strange occurrence happened. A man walked into the cafe, tall and gaunt, his face shadowed by the brim of his worn-out cap. He was a familiar face, the kind of person who came in every now and then, ordering the same thing, a black coffee and a cinnamon roll. Nothing about him seemed unusual at first, but something about the way he moved caught the worker's attention. He moved slowly, almost as if he were in a trance. His footsteps echoed in the otherwise silent cafe, and when he reached the counter, he didn't speak, just nodded his head as though he already knew what he wanted. The worker smiled politely, a little unnerved by the man's strange behavior, but brushing it off as just another odd customer. He made the coffee and placed the cinnamon roll on a plate, sliding it across the counter. The man took it, still silent, and retreated to a corner, booth in the back. The worker watched him for a moment, then turned back to clean the counter. He didn't think much of it at first. It was only when he went to check on the man that things began to take a strange turn. He approached the booth, expecting to see the man sipping his coffee and enjoying his pastry, but when he reached the corner, the seat was empty. He blinked, confused, and glanced around the cafe. There was no sign of the man anywhere. The cafe was small, so he would have noticed if he had gotten up and left. The worker stood there for a moment, unsure of what to think. He even checked the restroom, but it was empty too. Shrugging it off, he returned to his work, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. The hours passed slowly and the cafe stayed empty, but as the clock ticked closer to closing time, a sense of unease settled over him. The quiet felt too heavy, too still. It was as if the whole cafe had been frozen in time. Then, the door chimed again, and another man walked in, this one even taller than the last. His coat was tattered, his boots caked with dirt. He was disheveled, and there was a strange glint in his eyes as he approached the counter. The worker didn't recognize him, and there was something about the man's eyes that unsettled him. "Can I help you?" the worker asked, his voice more tense than usual. The man didn't respond at first. He just stood there staring at the worker with that same unsettling look. Finally, he spoke in a low, rasping voice. "Is he still here?" The worker frowned. "Who?" The man didn't answer, just kept staring at him. The worker swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked around, half expecting to see the first man sitting at one of the tables, but the cafe was still empty. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean," the worker said, forcing himself to remain calm. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He laid it on the counter, and the worker, curious and a little apprehensive, glanced down at it. It was an old receipt, the paper yellowed with age. The date on it was years ago, before the worker had even started working at the cafe. It was a receipt for a coffee and a cinnamon roll. "Who gave you this?" the worker asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was a twisted, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. He did. The worker took a step back, his heart racing. There was something deeply wrong here, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He glanced at the door again, wondering if anyone would come in to break the tension, but no one did. "I'm sorry, I don't think I can help you," the worker said, his voice shaky now. He reached for the phone behind the counter, intending to call for help, but before he could dial, the man turned and walked out of the cafe, his boots tapping softly on the floor as he left. The worker stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He picked up the receipt and looked at it again. It was the same one from earlier, the same order, the same date. But how could that be? The man who had come in earlier was gone. And yet, this new man had seemed to know something about him. Shaking, he made his way to the back of the cafe, to the corner booth where the first man had sat. He checked again, but the booth was empty. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that he was missing something. That's when he saw it, the reflection in the window. For a moment, it was just a shadow, something fleeting in the corner of his vision. But when he turned to face it, there was nothing. No one, except for the faintest trace of a figure standing in the corner booth. A figure with a worn-out cap, a tall frame, and eyes that stared at him with an unnerving stillness. The worker's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the figure in the booth wasn't just a reflection. It was the same man from before. But now he was closer, and this time the man wasn't just sitting, he was standing, watching.